Morning of April 9th, 1241, arrived quietly over the Silesian plain, the kind of cold, grey dawn that gives no warning of what it is carrying. A thin mist sat low across the field southeast of Legnica, and in that half-light, tens of thousands of men stood in silence, breath rising in small clouds, listening to a stillness that felt less like peace and less like calm, and more like the moment before a door swings open onto something you cannot take back. Duke Henry II of Silesia had spent weeks building this army. Polish knights, Moravian cavalry, a small contingent of Templars sent by the Pope himself. 30,000 men. And somewhere one day's march to the east, 50,000 more were coming to reinforce him. The math was almost reassuring. Almost. On the other side of the field, a Mongol force that had already burned Krakow and destroyed every army it had touched was waiting. Not charging, not threatening, just waiting, the way something waits when it already knows how this ends. Henry did not know what was about to happen to him, but we do, and it is worth staying to watch, because what unfolds in the next few hours changes everything. Picture a morning in early April, 1241. The sun is just beginning to lift over the Silesian plain, somewhere southeast of the city of Legnica in what is now southern Poland. The air is cold and damp, the way only a Central European spring morning can be, and a thin mist sits low across the fields, clinging to the grass and the bare patches of earth. There are no dramatic storm clouds here, no blood-red sky, just a grey, quiet dawn that looks, for a moment, like any other. But it is not any other morning. And the men who are already awake, tens of thousands of them on both sides of this open ground, know it. On one side of that field stands something that has not existed in this corner of Europe in living memory. A serious, unified attempt to stop the Mongol advance. Duke Henry II of Silesia, the man they would come to call Henry the Pious, has spent weeks pulling together every available fighting force in the region. Polish knights, Moravian cavalry, Teutonic volunteers, a small contingent of Knights Templar, some of the most trained and disciplined fighters in the Christian world. His army numbers somewhere between 25 and 30,000 men. Not a small force, not a ragtag militia. This is a real army, and Henry has positioned it here, at this place that history would later call Legnickie Pole, the field of Legnica, because he is waiting for something, or rather, someone. One day's march to the east, his brother-in-law, King Wenceslas of Bohemia, is moving toward him with an army of 50,000 men. 50,000. If those two forces combine, they would outnumber the Mongol detachment in Poland by more than 4-1. The math is not complicated. Henry knows it. His commanders know it. And on the other side of that field, the Mongol commanders, Baydar and Kadan, grandsons of Genghis Khan, know it too. Which is exactly why they are not waiting for dawn to fully break. Here is what you need to understand about what is at stake on April 9th, 1241. This is not simply a battle between two armies over a piece of territory. It is not a border skirmish, not a regional dispute, not even a conventional war. The Mongol force that has reached this field in Silesia is the western arm of the most effective military machine the world has ever seen up to that point, and it has been cutting through kingdoms and armies like they were made of paper. Russia, the Kievan Rus, the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia, all of them gone, subjugated, burned, or depopulated in just the years before this morning. And the force that came to Poland was not even the main Mongol army. It was a diversion, a sideshow, a detachment sent to keep the northern Europeans too occupied to ride south and interfere with the real invasion of Hungary. That detail is going to matter a great deal before this day is over. Because here is the thing about Henry's position, the thing that makes what is about to happen so maddening when you look back at it. He was not in a hopeless situation. He was one day away from turning it into a decisive advantage. One day away from having an army large enough to genuinely threaten the Mongols' entire western flank. One day away from potentially changing the entire trajectory of the invasion. But one moment changed everything. A single decision, a single instant in the chaos of battle, and everything that was possible on the morning of April 9th became impossible by noon. This is that story. To understand what happened at Legnica, you have to go back a generation, to the death of Genghis Khan in 1227. When the great conqueror died, his empire did not die with him. If anything, it accelerated. His son, Ogedei Khan, took the throne and proved to be, in his own right, a capable administrator and an ambitious strategist. Ogedei understood something that many empire builders have learned the hard way. You cannot sustain conquest on momentum alone. You need structure, you need organization, you need a capital, a bureaucracy, a system for extracting wealth from the lands you have already taken. He built Karakorum as a proper imperial city, established the administrative machinery to govern the vast territories his father had won, and then turned his attention west. The man he trusted to actually plan and execute the Western campaign was not a prince of the blood. His name was Subutai, and he was perhaps the most gifted operational commander of the medieval world. Subutai had been fighting alongside Genghis Khan since he was a young man. He had helped design the destruction of the Kievan Rus. He had sent spies into Poland, Hungary, and as far as Austria, studying their political structures, their military habits, their personal rivalries, their geography. By the time the campaign began, Subutai knew more about the internal dynamics of the European kingdoms than most of their own nobles did. He understood, for instance, that the Polish dukes did not particularly like each other. He understood that the relationship between Hungary and the Holy Roman Empire was complicated and hostile. He understood that the one thing that might save Europe, a unified military response, was essentially impossible given how these kingdoms related to each other. So, when the campaign launched in the winter of 1240 to 1241, Subutai planned for the one threat he genuinely feared. The possibility that the northern European forces, particularly the Poles and the military orders, might swing south and hit the main Mongol army in the flank while it was focused on Hungary. To neutralize that threat, he sent a detachment, a force of somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 horsemen, depending on which source you follow, under Baidar and Kadań northward into Poland. Their job was not conquest. Their job was destruction and distraction. Keep the northern Europeans busy, defeat them in the field if possible, and then rejoin the main army in Hungary. This is the strategic context that Henry II was operating inside, and the bitter irony is that he did not fully grasp it. He knew the Mongols were coming. He had watched the reports come in for weeks, each one more alarming than the last. But he likely believed he was facing the main thrust of the invasion, not a calculated diversion. That misunderstanding, that entirely reasonable misunderstanding, given the information available to him, shaped every decision he made. Now, who was Henry? The chronicles give us a man of genuine ability and real piety, which is where the nickname came from. He was the Duke of Silesia and, in practice, the most powerful Polish prince of his generation. The kind of leader who could actually compel other nobles to follow him rather than just ask. He had governed Silesia capably for years. He understood that the fractured political landscape of Poland in 1241 was a weakness, and he had worked methodically and sometimes at great personal cost to build the broadest possible coalition to face this threat. When he learned that the Mongols were burning their way across southern Poland, he made a strategic choice that tells you something about his character. He abandoned Wrocław, his own capital, his largest city, rather than get bogged down defending it. He ordered the population to evacuate and left the walls with a skeleton garrison, because he understood that winning this battle required concentrating force, not dispersing it. That was not a coward's decision. That was a commander's decision. Difficult, painful, and strategically correct. But the Mongol advance was doing something else to the Polish countryside that no tactical decision could fully account for. It was spreading fear. And not ordinary battlefield fear. The kind of deep, bone-level terror that comes from hearing what happened to the people in the city before yours. Let me tell you what the months before Legnica looked like from ground level. In early February of 1241, a Mongol force struck the town of Sandomierz. The garrison put up a fight. The town surrendered on assurances of safety. Then the Mongols killed everyone anyway, burned the buildings, and moved on. Word spread. In March, at the Battle of Chmielnik, a Polish army that had been hastily assembled from the forces of Krakow and Sandomierz tried to make a stand. They were not small. They were not untrained. They were destroyed so completely and so quickly that the survivors scattered in every direction, some of them running for days. The Mongols were not just winning battles. They were winning them in ways that made people feel as though resistance itself was pointless. Krakow, one of the great cities of Central Europe at the time, was simply abandoned by its population before the Mongols even arrived. The people just left. They packed what they could carry and ran, because the reports coming from the east described something that did not seem to respond to walls or weapons or prayers in the way that human enemies did. This is the atmosphere in which Henry is assembling his army at Legnica. The men marching into his camp are not fresh, confident soldiers at the beginning of a campaign. They are men who have heard the stories. Some of them have relatives in Krakow. Some of them helped evacuate Wrocław. They have seen the smoke on the eastern horizon. And they are fighting anyway because Henry is asking them to. Because the alternative is to simply let this thing roll over everything they have ever known. The political map of Poland in 1241 is worth pausing on for a moment, because it explains so much about why this disaster unfolded the way it did. Poland at this time was not a unified kingdom in any meaningful military sense. It had been divided through the inheritance customs of the Piast dynasty into 4 separate duchies, each governed by a prince who was technically from the same family as the others, but who had spent the preceding decades competing with those family members for land, influence, and resources. The 4 Piast princes were not enemies exactly, but they were not allies in the way that a unified command structure would require them to be. There was no Polish king in 1241 with the authority to order all 4 princes to march together under a single commander and a single plan. This was not a secret weakness. Subutais scouts had identified it months before the campaign began, and it shaped everything about how the Mongol diversion was designed. Not as a direct assault that would trigger a unified defensive response, but as a rapid series of blows delivered in different directions simultaneously, specifically intended to keep the Polish forces from ever concentrating long enough to outnumber the Mongols on any single field. Attack Sandomierz in the southeast. Hit Khmelnyk. Burn Krakow. By the time the Poles understood what was happening, 3 of their available armies had already been defeated in detail. Henry was working with whatever was left. There is a detail in the sources that brings this home very directly. When Henry made the decision to evacuate Wrocław rather than defend it, he was not just making a military choice. He was making a statement about what he was willing to sacrifice for the sake of concentration of force. And that statement had a cost that he personally felt. Wrocław was his capital. It was where he governed, where his court was, where his family's history was anchored. Abandoning it was like a modern general ordering the evacuation of his own hometown. He did it anyway, because he understood the arithmetic. The question was whether the arithmetic would hold long enough for Wenceslas to arrive. There is something in that, in the willingness to show up and fight even when you are genuinely frightened, that deserves a moment of acknowledgement before we move on to the mechanics of what went wrong. These were not men of iron who felt no fear. They were men who felt fear and came to the field regardless. And they were one day, just one single day, from having odds that might actually have worked in their favour. King Wenceslas of Bohemia was marching with 50,000 men. He was Wenceslas I, Henry's brother-in-law, and he was coming. Henry knew this. His commanders knew this. The entire logic of making a stand at Legnica, of choosing this particular spot and this particular moment to stop retreating, was built on the assumption that within 24 hours the combined force would be so large that even the Mongols would have to recalculate. Henry was not gambling on a miracle. He was gambling on arithmetic. But Baidar and Khadan knew about Wenceslas too, and that knowledge was the reason they were moving before dawn. Legnica Pole is not what a medieval European commander would have chosen as a defensive position if he had a choice. There are no hills here to speak of, no river to anchor a flank, no narrow defile through which a larger army can be bottlenecked. It is open ground, broad, relatively flat, the kind of terrain that favours mobility over mass, that rewards manoeuvring cavalry over standing formations. For the Mongols, who had spent a generation perfecting the art of mounted archery on exactly this kind of open plain, it was close to ideal. For Henry's army, which depended on the disciplined charge of heavy cavalry followed by the weight of infantry, it was considerably less so. Henry probably did not choose this ground because it suited his tactics. He chose it because it was where the Mongols caught him. He had been pulling his forces together around the city of Legnica, waiting for Wenceslas, when Baidar and Khadan broke off their attempt to take Wrocław and turned southwest to engage him before the Bohemian army could arrive. Henry had a decision to make: retreat into the city and wait behind walls, or come out and fight in the open. He came out. Whether that was the right call is something historians have debated ever since, but the reasoning is at least understandable. Walls can be surrounded and starved. An open battle, especially one that might last only a day or two before Wenceslas arrived, offered at least the possibility of holding the Mongols in place, rather than letting them continue to devastate the countryside. So, on the evening of April 8th, 1241, Henry's army made camp on the plain southeast of Legnica, at the place that would be remembered simply as the field, and they prepared for battle the next morning. Henry organized his force into 4 divisions, and the structure of those divisions tells you something about who was actually available to him by this point in the campaign. The first division was led by Boleslav of Moravia and consisted largely of miners from the Goldberg region, men from Złotoria, conscripted fighters who were brave enough but who came to this battle carrying tools more suited to underground work than open combat. The second division was commanded by Sulislav, the brother of the recently killed Palatine of Krakow, and it drew from the remnants of the Polish forces that had already been beaten at Tursko and Chmielnik. These were soldiers who had already tasted Mongol warfare once and survived it, which meant they knew what was coming, and that knowledge cut both ways. The third division, the cavalry of Opole, was under Duke Mieszko II, a man history would remember by the unflattering nickname of Mieszko the Fat, a detail that will become relevant later. And the fourth division, under Henry's direct command, held the Silesian Knights, the Moravian heavy cavalry, and the Templars. That last group, the Templars, deserves a word. There were not many of them. The contemporary sources suggest somewhere between 68 and 88 trained brother knights, plus a larger number of their retainers and associated fighters. But the Templars were not just soldiers. They were professionals in the truest medieval sense of that word, men who had trained for combat their entire adult lives, who operated under a discipline and a command structure that was genuinely unusual in the feudal armies of the 13th century. Their presence at Legnica was a statement of how seriously the papacy and the military orders were taking this threat. Pope Gregory IX had specifically directed them to go, and their quality, even in small numbers, gave Henry's 4th Division a hard core of soldiers who would not break easily. On the other side of the plain, Baidar and Khadan had deployed a force that looked, on the surface, considerably smaller than Henry's. The exact numbers are genuinely uncertain. Medieval sources are hopeless on this, with some European accounts suggesting over 100,000 Mongols at Legnica, which is mathematically impossible given the total force deployed in Europe at the time. Modern historians generally estimate the Mongol detachment at somewhere between 8,000 and 20,000, with the lower estimates based on the unit compositions described in the primary sources and the casualties they would have already suffered in earlier engagements. Whatever the exact number, Henry almost certainly had more men on the field that morning. That fact is important, because it helps explain what happened next. The Mongol tactical system that Baidar and Khadan were deploying was not improvised. It was a doctrine that had been refined and perfected over decades of warfare across the steppes of Central Asia, across Persia, across Russia. At its core was a unit called the Mangudai, the vanguard screen, light cavalry archers whose specific job was to make contact with the enemy, draw fire, and then retreat. Not rout, retreat. The distinction matters enormously. A rout is chaos, uncontrolled, every man for himself. A Mangudai withdrawal was a controlled, rehearsed maneuver, with the riders maintaining formation even as they appeared to be fleeing. The horses were trained to turn and run without panicking. The riders were trained to fire arrows backward over their horses' haunches while appearing to flee. It looked, to an observer who did not know what they were watching, exactly like a routed cavalry screen breaking under pressure. And behind the Mangudai, concealed on the flanks or in the folds of the terrain, the real force waited. Heavy cavalry, fresh horses, composite bows that could punch through chainmail at 150 yards. A communication system based on flags and signal arrows that could coordinate movements across a battlefield in ways that European armies of the time could not match. The Mongol commanders could direct their units with a precision that would not look out of place in a modern military operation. Henry's commanders directed their troops largely through the medium of shouting and the personal example of riding to the front. There was one more element that the Mongols had prepared, and it may be the detail that most clearly illustrates the gap between these two military traditions. Sometime in the days before the battle, almost certainly during the night of April 8th, while Henry's men were making their final preparations, Mongol scouts had been out on the plain, identifying the spots where the ground held dry reeds or brush, and stockpiling fuel at strategic locations. They were not building campfires, they were building smoke screens. When the moment came, those piles would be lit, and the thick black smoke would roll across the battlefield, cutting Henry's cavalry off from his infantry, hiding Mongol movements, and creating exactly the kind of confusion in which their tactics were most effective. That night, in Henry's camp, men prayed. The sources do not give us individual names for most of the soldiers in that army, but we know enough about medieval warfare to reconstruct what the hours before a major battle looked like. Knights checked their armour, looking for weak points, replacing rivets, adjusting straps. Sergeants walked the picket lines, keeping the horses calm. The Templars, as was their custom, would have attended a night office, the prayers that structured the monastic hours, because for them, warfare and religious devotion were literally inseparable. They had vowed to fight in service of their faith, and they took that vow with absolute seriousness. Some men sharpened blades. Some men got as much sleep as they could manage, because experienced soldiers know that fear is exhausting, and you need whatever reserves you can build before the morning. Some men, surely, lay awake and thought about home. Henry, by the accounts we have, was a genuinely devout man, and the chronicle tradition tells us that he attended Mass before leading his army out of the city on the morning of the battle. What the same tradition tells us, in a detail that people at the time would have read as prophetic, is that as he rode out through the streets of Legnica, past the church of St. Mary, a stone fell from the roof and narrowly missed his horse. No one was hurt. Henry rode on, but the people watching from the windows and doorways of the city took it as an omen, and in the world of the 13th century, omens were not abstractions. They were communications from God. The soldiers who saw it carried that image with them onto the field. The Mongol commanders, for their part, spent the night in the kind of focused, practical preparation that was characteristic of their military culture. Routes were confirmed, signals were rehearsed, the smoke piles were positioned. Baidar and Kadan had one primary objective for the coming day. They needed to defeat Henry's army before Wenceslas arrived. They could not allow the European forces to combine. If that meant fighting an army that outnumbered theirs, so be it. They had done that before. The tactics were designed precisely for this kind of situation, for fighting larger, slower, less mobile enemies in open terrain. All they needed was for Henry to do what every European commander they had faced so far had done: to see the Mangudai break and to send his cavalry charging after them. Henry was a good commander. He was not a foolish man. But he was fighting inside a military framework that had no experience with what was about to happen. And experience, the deep, instinctive, almost physical understanding of how a specific type of warfare works, cannot be replaced by intelligence alone. The sun rose over Lenitskipol on April 9th, 1241. Both armies saw it. The battle opened with sound. Before a single sword was drawn, before the cavalry began to move, the morning air over Lenitskipol filled with noise. The low, massed murmur of thousands of men and horses shifting into position, punctuated by the sharp calls of officers, and the occasional whinny of a horse reacting to the tension around it. The sounds of a large cavalry formation preparing to advance are unlike anything else. The metallic clinking of armor and harness, the dull percussion of hooves on turf, the creak of leather, the particular quality that a crowd of armed men generates when every one of them is paying absolute attention to what is directly in front of him. Henry's army was arrayed across the plain in its 4 divisions. Cavalry formations toward the front, the less mobile infantry and conscripted fighters positioned to support and follow. The Templar contingent rode with Henry's own division, identifiable by the black and white of their battle standard. Across the field, the Mongol formation was visible but difficult to read. Small groups of light cavalry moved in what appeared to be a loose, almost disorganized way. The main body was held back in a manner that looked, to European eyes, almost tentative. But it was not tentative. Every movement on that field had been rehearsed. What Henry could not see was what was waiting behind that screen. The first contact was made by Boleslav of Moravia's division, the miners and conscripts on the left flank, advancing toward the Mongol forward units. The response was immediate and startling. The Mongol light cavalry did not stand and receive the advance. They opened fire at ranges that seemed almost impossibly long by European standards, and then they moved, not charging to meet the oncoming Europeans, but shifting laterally, changing angles, staying just outside of effective lance range, pouring a continuous stream of arrows into the advancing formation. Men began to fall. Horses stumbled. The advance slowed and stopped, not because of a single catastrophic blow, but because of the cumulative weight of arrows coming from an enemy that would not stand still long enough to be engaged. But the Mongols did not press the advantage. They pulled back slightly, maintaining distance, keeping the rhythm of harassment rather than committing to contact. It was as if they were content to sting rather than strike. Boleslav's division pulled back. The Mongol forward units had not broken, had not advanced dramatically, had simply inflicted losses and withdrawn. It was an opening statement about what this battle was going to feel like. Henry adjusted. Instead of committing his full force frontally, he directed Sulislav's cavalry on the right and Mieszko's Opole cavalry on the left to advance simultaneously, attempting to force the Mongol forward line to either spread thin or commit to a direct engagement. It was a reasonable tactical response, but reasonable was exactly what the Mongols were counting on. As Sulislav's cavalry came forward on the right, the Mongol forward screen in that sector turned and ran. Not retreated in a controlled manner, ran, or at least appeared to run. The horses were moving fast, the formation was opening up, men were separating, and the whole visual image was of a unit that had decided it wanted nothing more to do with this situation. But this was the Mangudai doing its job. The appearance of flight was the job, and Sulislav's cavalry, seeing this, did exactly what cavalry that sees a fleeing enemy is supposed to do. They charged. This is the moment. Not the single decisive moment, that comes later, but the moment when the first piece of the trap snapped into place. Sulislav's horsemen went forward at speed, their lances coming down, the ground shaking with the weight of armoured men and horses accelerating across open turf. But the enemy they were chasing did not slow down. The gap between the Polish cavalry and the Mongol screen held, because the Mongol horses were faster over open ground and the riders were lighter, and their formation, despite looking like a rout, was maintaining exactly the spacing its commanders had planned. The Polish knights were charging into empty space that kept moving away from them. But they kept charging, because that is what you do when the enemy is running. You stay on them. You don't let them regroup. You press the advantage. By the time Sulisław's cavalry had covered several hundred yards in pursuit, something had changed behind them. The infantry had not kept up. The distance between the charging cavalry and the supporting formations was opening. Not by much, not yet, but the gap was there, and it was growing with every stride of every horse. On the Mongol side of the field, flags moved. Signal arrows flew. The prearranged responses, rehearsed until they were automatic, began to execute. But the cavalry charge was still happening. Sulisław's men were still moving forward, still committed, still believing that the men they were pursuing were about to be cornered or turned at bay. But the Mongol screen was not going to turn at bay. It was going to lead the Polish cavalry to exactly the place where the next phase of the battle was waiting. The centre of the field, by this point in the morning, had the particular chaos of an engagement that has not yet resolved itself into a clear outcome. The Mongol forward units on Mieszko's sector were performing the same feigned withdrawal on the left that the Ogedei had executed on the right. Mieszko's cavalry was advancing, but had not yet fully committed. Henry, from his position with the rear division, was watching the battle develop and trying to form a picture of it from what he could see, which was incomplete, and from the riders who came back with reports which were more incomplete still. The picture he was forming was of an enemy that was giving ground across the entire front. But that picture was not accurate. The ground was being given on purpose. And then, before Henry could fully process what he was seeing or issue a consolidated response, the smoke began. It did not rise gradually the way campfire smoke does. The dry reeds and brush that had been positioned the night before caught immediately, and within minutes the fires had generated a thick, rolling wall of black and grey that moved across the plain on the wind, which was blowing, as the Mongol scouts had calculated, directly toward Henry's formation. Within a very short time, Sulisław's cavalry, which had been visible perhaps 400 yards ahead, was gone. Not retreating, not turning back, simply invisible, swallowed by a moving curtain of smoke that had no natural cause and no obvious boundary, and offered no indication of when it might thin. But the smoke had one effect beyond simply blocking vision that the Mongols had anticipated and the Europeans had not. It severed the command network. In a medieval army, command works through visibility. A commander gives an order by riding to the relevant part of the field, or by sending a rider who can find the relevant officer because he can see where that officer is. Take away sight, and you take away the ability to coordinate. The Mongol communication system, built on flags above the smoke line and signal arrows and pre-arranged maneuvers that were rehearsed until they were instinct, functioned in the smoke because it did not depend on line of sight in the same way. But Henry's command structure had nothing equivalent. Every order he tried to give had to travel through riders who could not find their targets. Every report he received was minutes out of date. He was commanding inside a fog in the most literal possible sense, and the fog had been designed specifically to disable him. The archers working the edges of the smoke were not firing blind. They were firing at sounds, at movement visible through the thinning edges, at the specific signatures of heavy cavalry churning up the spring turf. A Mongol horse archer in 1241, firing from horseback at the gallop, was capable of 4 to 5 aimed shots per minute. Across a detachment of several hundred archers operating around the perimeter of the smoke, the mathematics of that become very dark very quickly. But the Europeans inside the smoke could not see the archers. They could hear the arrows. They could hear men screaming when arrows found them. But they could not find the source, could not charge toward it with any coherence, could not make the kind of massed cavalry response that was the only tactic in their repertoire that had any chance of disrupting the archery. The heavy cavalry was the most powerful military force in the Christian world, but it was powerless against an enemy it could not see. And then, from within the smoke itself, came the sound that broke what remained of European cohesion on that field. Voices. Polish voices. Screaming one word over and over from somewhere in the smoke. Biegnijcie, biegnijcie. Run, run. Not Mongol voices. Someone had been taught this word for this specific moment and was riding through the smoke, delivering it in the language the men around him spoke at the level of reflex, bypassing rational thought and speaking directly to the part of the brain that responds to warnings in a familiar voice. We do not know with certainty that this was the deciding factor, but the chronicles describe a collapse in Polish formation that seems to have been partly tactical. The cavalry was surrounded and being cut down, and partly something less reducible to tactics. The infantry, blind in the smoke, could hear fighting ahead and men running behind, and the structure that holds an army together in those circumstances is information. Knowing where your commanders are, knowing what you are supposed to do next. That structure had been destroyed. The word in the smoke was the final weight on a balance that was already tipping. Sulisław's cavalry, cut off from the infantry, found itself surrounded in stages rather than all at once. The Mongol heavy cavalry that had been held in reserve throughout the opening phases came around both flanks, not through the smoke, but around it, appearing on the sides of the Polish horsemen like something that had materialized from the landscape itself. The light cavalry that had been feigning retreat turned back. The archers closed the range, and the specific horror of what it means to be a heavily armoured knight in that situation became real. Your armour, which protects you against swords and lances, does not protect your horse. But a dead horse pins you to the ground, and once a heavily armoured man is on the ground, without his horse, without room to manoeuvre, surrounded, he is not a formidable opponent. He is a man in a metal box who cannot move fast enough to survive. The Polish infantry was being struck from multiple directions now, the light cavalry sweeping around the flanks of the infantry formation, while the archers maintained fire through whatever gaps the smoke offered. But the infantry had no coordinated response, because there was no coordinated command structure left. Individual officers made individual decisions. Some men tried to advance toward the cavalry they could no longer see. Some men ran. Some men stood and tried to form defensive clusters, which worked for a while and then did not. By the time the sun had reached something close to noon, the best time anchor we can put on this phase of the battle, the field south of Legnica had changed entirely from what it had been 2 hours earlier. 2 hours earlier, it had been an open contest between two armies, one larger but slower, one smaller but more mobile, with the outcome genuinely uncertain. But by noon, it was not a contest anymore. It was a pursuit, a destruction, the mechanical final phase of a tactical plan that had executed almost precisely as its designers had intended. Mieszko the Fat, commanding the Opole cavalry on the left flank, made his decision somewhere in this chaos. He pulled his division back and rode clear of the field, The sources do not record what he said or what he was thinking, but the result of his departure was that the left flank of Henry's remaining force became completely open, and the Mongol cavalry that had been pressing on that side had nothing in front of it. But Mieszko's departure did not end the battle, it just accelerated the ending. The Templars fought with the discipline their training demanded, but training can only carry you so far against a force that has you surrounded and outnumbered, and is maintaining a continuous archery fire from angles you cannot effectively close. The Templar report to the King of France, written afterward in the measured language of men who have been raised to process grief through duty, describes losses of 9 brothers, 3 knights, 2 sergeants, and around 500 associated men. But that number, however carefully counted, cannot convey what it actually cost to stand on that field to the end. We should be honest about what we do not know regarding Henry's last minutes. The sources disagree on details in the way that accounts of deaths in battle always do, but they agree on the outline. He was trying to break out of the encirclement with 3 bodyguards. He was wounded in the arm. He was unhorsed, or his horse was killed. He was killed and beheaded. The Chronicle of Jan Długosz, written 2 centuries later, is the most detailed account. But Długosz was drawing on sources that had themselves been transmitted for generations. The image of Henry fighting his way out rather than surrendering is almost certainly truer in spirit than it is in precise physical detail. But nothing in any source suggests he did otherwise, and everything we know about the man suggests he would not have. Henry II of Silesia, Duke of Silesia, the man they called the Pious, died on Legnickie Pole on April 9th, 1241. He was 38 years old. His head was mounted on a Mongol lance and carried around the walls of Legnica in a display that was designed to break the garrison's will. But the castle held. The Mongols had not come to besiege cities. They had come to destroy a field army. The battle that followed, in the final phase before the field went quiet, is not a battle in the conventional sense. It is the systematic collapse of a force that has lost the internal structures that make organized resistance possible. An army does not simply stop fighting all at once. It stops fighting in pieces. This unit first, then that one, then the officers running out of men to command, and men running out of officers to follow. The process is gradual and then suddenly terribly complete. The Polish infantry formations that had not yet been directly engaged found themselves in an impossible situation. They had been positioned to support the cavalry, but the cavalry was gone. Some of it destroyed, some of it still fighting somewhere in the smoke, all of it no longer visible and no longer coordinating. The infantry's role was to follow up cavalry success, to hold ground that the horses had cleared, to provide a stable base that the mounted forces could fall back to if they needed to rally. But there was no cavalry success to follow up, and no ground to hold, and no rallying happening. There was just smoke and arrows, and the sound of fighting that was moving in directions that suggested the cavalry was being pushed back rather than pressing forward. Some infantry units tried to advance through the smoke toward where the cavalry sounds were coming from, but the Mongol light cavalry met them at the edges, and the specific tactical problem of infantry trying to engage mounted archers on open ground in the 13th century is a problem with very few solutions. The horses are faster. The bows have longer range than the spears. The infantry can form a defensive cluster and resist the arrows for a time, but it cannot advance without breaking formation, and it cannot do anything about the cavalry circling it. But it can die slowly, which is not a tactical option. Henry's attempts to coordinate a response were becoming increasingly abstract. He could issue orders, but riders could not find their destinations. He could see the smoke, but not through it. What he could see, clearly and concretely, was that the men who had been in front of him were no longer visible, and the men returning through the smoke were coming back without horses, without weapons, without coherent accounts of what they had just experienced. He advanced with his own division. Whether he believed a coordinated response was still possible, or whether he was trying to cover a retreat that was already happening, the sources do not tell us clearly. But both possibilities end the same way on the afternoon of April 9th, 1241. The Mongol heavy cavalry that engaged Henry's division was the same force that had destroyed Sulislav's men. It had regrouped while the light cavalry and archers continued working the rest of the field, and it came back into the engagement from the southwest, which put it on Henry's flank rather than his front. But a flank attack against a division that is already advancing and committed is one of the most effective things you can do to it. The men on the struck side cannot turn fast enough. The formation buckles from the inside, and the whole unit's momentum, which was its strength, becomes a liability, because it cannot stop. The fighting in this final phase was close. This is where the Templars earned the account that Pons d'Aubon sent to the King of France. In direct engagement, in the kind of combat that their training had prepared them for, standing their ground. But standing your ground when you are surrounded on three sides by an enemy that still has arrows is not a sustainable military position. It is a way of dying with honor rather than dying in flight, which meant something specific to men who had sworn their lives to the faith. But it did not change the outcome. By mid-afternoon, the field was theirs. Wenceslas learned what had happened at Legnica the way most people learned news in the 13th century, through riders, arriving separately, their accounts not perfectly consistent with each other, but consistent enough in the essentials. Henry was dead. The army was destroyed. The Mongols held the field. Wenceslas stopped. He turned his 50,000 men around and began marching back toward Bohemia. Not because he was a coward, he was not, but because the strategic logic of his situation had just changed completely. He had been marching to join a coalition. The coalition no longer existed. Riding forward alone against the force that had just annihilated Henry's army was not bravery. It was arithmetic. The Mongols did not let him go without a response. Baidar and Khadan sent a cavalry detachment to pursue him. Not 50,000 men, a much smaller force, because their larger objective was already in sight. The detachment caught up with Wenceslas near the town of Kłodzko, where the Bohemian king had time to organize his forces and position them in terrain that suited his cavalry. The Mongol detachment was beaten off. Wenceslas survived and made it back to Bohemia, where he would spend the next months gathering reinforcements from Thuringia and Saxony, preparing for an invasion that ultimately did not come. Baidar and Khadan did not pursue into Bohemia. Their orders had been specific: disrupt and distract, then rejoin the main army. They had accomplished their mission with a thoroughness that exceeded almost any reasonable expectation. In the weeks following Legnica, Mongol raiding parties spread across Silesia in a pattern that was part military and part psychological, burning villages, destroying whatever food stores and agricultural infrastructure they could reach, creating a landscape of ruin that would take years to recover from. But they did not try to hold any of it. They were not establishing an occupation. They were burning the furniture on their way out the door. By mid-April, Baidar and Khadan's forces were moving southeast, crossing the Carpathian Mountains to rejoin Battu Khan and Subutai in Hungary. The main Mongol army had not been idle while Poland burned. On April 11th, 1241, just 2 days after Legnica, Battu Khan and Subutai met the Hungarian army under King Bela IV at the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River. What happened there was even more catastrophic than what happened at Legnica. The Hungarians were surrounded, their camp was burned with them inside it, and their army was essentially annihilated. Bela escaped. Hungary did not. The two battles, Legnica on April 9th, Mohi on April 11th, represent the high watermark of the Mongol advance into Europe. In 4 days, the two largest military forces that Central Europe could field had been destroyed. Poland was effectively open. Hungary was occupied and being systematically depopulated. The Mongols spent the summer and fall of 1241 resting and consolidating in the Hungarian plain, and the winter of 1241 to 1242 was one in which the people of Poland, Austria, and what remained of Christian Hungary genuinely did not know if the spring would bring a final assault that went all the way to the Atlantic. Back at Legnickie Pole, the battlefield was empty now. The armies had moved on in both directions. What remained was the specific archaeology of a catastrophic defeat. Broken lances, discarded shields, torn standards, the personal effects of men who would never come home to collect them. The bodies, stripped of valuables and weapons by whoever came through next, lay in the positions where they had fallen. The horses, too. The spring grass was already beginning to grow through the frozen ground around them. The indifferent biological machinery of a landscape that had seen violence before and would see it again and would keep growing regardless. The head of Henry II was eventually recovered and his body identified. The story goes that his wife, the noblewoman Anna of Bohemia, identified him by the presence of 6 toes on one foot, because the beheading had made his face impossible to use as an identifier. He was given a Christian burial at the monastery of the Cistercians at Lubyanka, and his memory was preserved with the care that the 13th century gave to men who died fighting for the faith. His wife founded a hospital. His son, Bolesław II, attempted to reconstitute some version of the Silesian Duchy. The machinery of mourning and continuation moved forward, because it always does. What the people of Silesia in the spring of 1241 did not yet know, what no one in Europe knew, was that the Mongol campaign was already over. They did not know this because the Mongols were still in Hungary. They did not know this because no one had told them. The silence from the east was not reassuring. It was simply silent. The reason the Mongols left Europe in 1242 is one of those historical facts that seems almost too strange to be true. Ogedei Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, son of Genghis Khan, the man whose ambition had set this entire campaign in motion, died on December 11th, 1241. He was 56 years old. He had been on a hunting trip, drinking heavily as he often did, and his body simply gave out. He was thousands of miles from the front lines, in a tent on the Mongolian steppe, and he died not in battle, but by degrees, the way men die when they have spent too long treating themselves badly. Under Mongol law, the death of a great Khan required all senior princes of the blood to return to Karakorum for the election of a successor. Battu Khan had been planning a second push west, into the Holy Roman Empire, into Austria, deeper into the heart of Europe. Subutai was ready. The intelligence was gathered, the routes were mapped. But Ogedei died, and Battu had to go home. That was it. That was the thing that stopped them. There is something uncomfortable about this that we should sit with for a moment. Europe was not saved by the valor of Henry's knights, or the strength of Bohemian cavalry, or the genius of any European commander. Europe was saved because a man drank himself to death on the other side of the world. The Mongol withdrawal from Hungary in the spring of 1242 was not the result of military defeat. It was the result of a succession crisis in a political system that required the physical presence of every senior prince at the moment of transition. The continent had stood at the edge of something genuinely catastrophic, and what pulled it back was the specific fragility of a human liver. But Europe did adapt. The wooden fortifications of Poland were rebuilt in stone after 1241, because the Mongols had demonstrated comprehensively what happened to wood. The political fragmentation that Subutai had exploited began, slowly and painfully, to consolidate into the unified Polish kingdom that would emerge in the following century. The memory of Legnica entered Polish identity not as a simple defeat, but as evidence that someone had shown up. That when the moment came, there were men who stood on that field, regardless of what the odds said. The tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw carries the date April 9th, 1241 among its inscriptions. The people who put it there were saying something specific, that the soldiers who died at Legnica deserved to be remembered, even the ones whose names are gone. Even the conscripted miners from Goldberg who came to that field with tools instead of swords and died there anyway. What the story of Legnica ultimately teaches is not comfortable. It does not resolve into a lesson about how courage wins in the end. Henry II the Pious was not a fool. He was fighting inside a framework that had no answer to what was being done to him. And he made the decision that any competent cavalry commander would have made when he saw the enemy breaking. He sent his cavalry forward. It was a reasonable decision. It was wrong. And the Mongol withdrawal from Europe in 1242 meant he never got the chance to learn from it. Centuries later, Legnickie Pole is a small, quiet village in southern Poland. There is a museum there now. Archaeologists have worked the surrounding land for generations and found mass graves, arrowheads of steppe design, skeletal remains showing trauma consistent with arrow wounds and heavy cavalry. The battle happened. The killing was real. The field absorbed it all and kept growing. If you stand there on a quiet April morning, when the mist is still low across the Silesian plain and the air carries that cold edge of early spring, you can almost feel it. The silence before the smoke rose, the moment before the order was given, the precise gap between the world where Henry's army was intact and the world where it was not. History turns on these moments more often than we like to admit. And sometimes the thing that saves you is not anything you did at all, but a man dying of drink, thousands of miles away, on a night when he probably just wanted one more cup. That is Legnica. And the question it leaves you with, about preparation, about doctrine, about the gap between courage and effectiveness, is a question that every army in every century has had to answer for itself. On the field where Henry the Pious made his last charge, the grass grows over all of them the same way. So that's the story. And if you've made it all the way here, honestly, that tells me something. It means something, and this landed with you. Maybe the part about Henry making a completely reasonable decision that turned out to be wrong. Or maybe the part about an entire continent being saved not by heroism, but by one man dying of drink on the other side of the world. Either way, here's what I keep coming back to. Courage isn't the same as being prepared. You can be brave, capable, and completely right about your own situation, and still walk straight into a trap you never saw coming. Not because you were careless, but because nobody handed you the map. The Stoics had a name for this. Epictetus said it plainly. It's not what happens to you, but how you respond to what you didn't see coming that defines you. Henry responded by fighting anyway. That's not nothing. That matters. So, if you're carrying something right now that feels unfair or unclear, or like the odds just shifted without warning, you're in good company across 8 centuries of human history. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a like and subscribe, because there are a lot more stories like this one waiting for you here.